The Royal Lodge, the 30-room residence of Prince Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson, has sparked public outrage over its lavish grandeur and the prince's right to live in such splendor on a crown estate.
For 22 years, a 30-room mansion inside Windsor Great Park was home to a woman the world had already written off once. Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, divorced from Prince Andrew in 1996, somehow never really left. She kept living beside her ex-husband at Royal Lodge, kept raising their daughters under that roof, kept showing up at royal events on his arm long after their marriage had ended on paper. For years, it looked like an arrangement built on nothing but goodwill and shared parenthood. By early 2026, it had collapsed completely, and Sarah Ferguson vanished from public life almost entirely. This is the real story of how it happened, not the rumors, not the invented quotes that have circulated online, but what has actually been confirmed by the palace, by police, and by the newspapers that have chased this story for the better part of a year. To understand how far she fell, you have to understand what she had. Royal Lodge sits inside Windsor Great Park, close enough to Windsor Castle that you could walk it. It has 30 rooms and a history that stretches back to the Queen Mother, who lived there for decades before her death. Andrew secured the lease in 2003, reportedly paying around £1 million for it, and the terms were extraordinary, a lease running until 2078, with rent that only needed to be paid if demanded, which in practice meant almost nothing. Ferguson moved in with him in 2008, more than a decade after their divorce, and stayed. Their daughter Eugenie held her wedding reception on the grounds in 2018. For years, this was simply how things were. Two divorced people, still close, still co-parenting, living together in one of the most desirable addresses in Britain, courtesy of an estate ultimately answerable to the crown. Ferguson had her own explanation for it, and she gave it publicly more than once. She called herself Andrew and their daughters a tripod, 3 legs holding up one family, bound by loyalty rather than romance. It made for a warm story, and for years it was largely accepted. But underneath that story sat a relationship that would eventually bring the whole arrangement down. Both Ferguson's and Andrew's long, well-documented friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. It's worth sitting with how unusual that arrangement really was, even before scandal entered the picture. Most divorced couples don't share a home, let alone one of this scale, for over a decade after the marriage legally ends. But Ferguson and Andrew had always been an unconventional pair. Their divorce in 1996 came after years of tabloid humiliation. The infamous toe-sucking photographs, financial troubles that dogged Ferguson for decades, a public image that swung between beloved and ridiculed. And yet the two of them never fully separated in the way most exes do. They vacationed together. They were photographed side by side at family weddings and funerals. Royal watchers had a name for it long before Ferguson coined the tripod herself. They called it one of the strangest arrangements in modern royal history, precisely because it worked, for a long time, on nothing more than mutual convenience and a shared devotion to their daughters. Both Beatrice and Eugenie have spoken warmly, over the years, about growing up with both parents effectively under one roof despite the divorce. For the family, and for the public that was invited to see it that way, it read as an unusually mature, low-drama arrangement between two people who simply preferred each other's company to living alone. That friendship had been a source of embarrassment for years, but it turned into a full-blown crisis for Andrew in November 2019, when he sat for a BBC Newsnight interview with journalist Emily Maitlis. The interview is remembered as one of the worst public relations disasters in modern royal history. Andrew struggled to account for his relationship with Epstein, offered explanations that read as evasive rather than convincing, and showed no real acknowledgement of Epstein's victims. Public opinion, which had already been souring, turned decisively against him. Ferguson, for her part, continued to defend him. She stayed at Royal Lodge. She stayed married to the story of the loyal ex-wife holding the family together, even as the ground underneath that story kept shifting. The real turning point came on October 30th, 2025. Buckingham Palace released a statement, brief, formal, and unusually blunt for an institution known for careful, understated language. King Charles III had begun the formal process of stripping his brother of the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. From that point forward, Andrew would be known simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The statement noted plainly that his lease on Royal Lodge had, to date, given him legal protection to remain in the property, and that formal notice had now been served requiring him to surrender it. He would move to alternative private accommodation, funded privately by the king rather than by the crown estate. The palace added one more line that mattered enormously. These censures were being imposed even though Andrew continued to deny the allegations against him. This was not a punishment tied to a criminal conviction. It was the family and the institution deciding it could no longer carry the weight of his presence. Andrew had actually preempted part of this. 13 days earlier, on October 17th, he'd released his own statement saying he would voluntarily give up his remaining titles and honors, framing it as a decision made in consultation with the king and his family, intended to stop the ongoing accusations from overshadowing the rest of the royal family's work. He said he was standing by his 2019 decision to step back from public duties, and insisted he was taking this further step with His Majesty's agreement. Whether this was a genuine act of humility or damage control ahead of a decision that was coming regardless is something people can debate. What isn't in debate is what came next. Within 2 weeks, the palace moved from stripping titles to terminating the Royal Lodge lease altogether, a cast-iron legal agreement that had been expected to protect Andrew's residency for decades. Negotiating around that lease, given the king's own obligation to respect the law, reportedly took real legal maneuvering behind the scenes. Crucially, that October 30th statement barely mentioned Sarah Ferguson. It addressed Andrew's titles, Andrew's lease, Andrew's future accommodation. It was understood that Ferguson, who had continued living at Royal Lodge with him since 2008 despite their divorce decades earlier, would also have to leave. But there was no acknowledgement of her 15-plus years there, no statement about her future, no formal provision made. Reports at the time noted that Andrew had wanted 2 homes as part of the arrangement. Frogmore Cottage, the former residence of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, for himself, and Adelaide Cottage, soon to be vacated by Prince William and Kate, for Ferguson. Neither request appears to have been granted. Sources close to Ferguson pushed back hard on the idea that she was seeking a handout at all. She had, they insisted, never asked for a property or provision for herself and intended to build an independent life going forward. What followed was months of uncertainty rather than a single dramatic exit. A move-out deadline of January 31st, 2026 was set for both of them. Through the final months of 2025, Ferguson was reportedly house-hunting around Windsor, weighing her options, while speculation swirled about where she might end up. An annex on Princess Beatrice's Oxfordshire estate, part-time residence near Princess Eugenie in Portugal. Both were specifically ruled out by people close to her. As the deadline approached, People magazine reported that Ferguson had left the country altogether, spending several weeks overseas to weigh her next move while a decision was made. Then, at the end of January 2026, everything accelerated. The U.S. Department of Justice released a massive tranche of documents connected to its Epstein investigation, reportedly more than 3 million pages. Among them were emails that named Ferguson directly and complicated the story she had told publicly for years. In a 2011 interview, she had called her association with Epstein a gigantic mistake, a single, regrettable error in judgment. The newly released correspondence painted a warmer, more sustained relationship than that framing suggested. In one exchange reported by multiple outlets, Ferguson apparently wrote to Epstein describing him as a steadfast, generous, and supreme friend to her and her family, language that sat uneasily next to her earlier public distancing. Her spokesperson later said the message had been sent in response to a defamation threat from Epstein, offering important context, though it did little to quiet the public reaction. The financial dimension of their relationship also drew scrutiny, with reporting suggesting Epstein had at points helped with debts that had dogged Ferguson publicly for years. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor left Royal Lodge on February 4, 2026, just days after those documents landed and just days after the original deadline had already passed. He didn't move immediately into a finished new home. It would be 2 more months before he formally settled into Marsh Farm, an 8-room property on the king's privately owned Sandringham estate, a fraction of the size of the home he was leaving. Ferguson did not go with him. Multiple outlets reported she had no intention of relocating to Sandringham and was instead determined, as one source close to her put it, to spread her wings independently after years of standing by her ex-husband through scandal after scandal. Her actual departure from Royal Lodge was murkier and far less clean than a single defining moment. In the days around the move-out deadline, a Daily Mail source described her as creeping back and forth from the property, arriving and leaving by car while lying down in the back seat to avoid being photographed or recognized. It's a striking image, a woman who had spent 2 decades as one of the most photographed figures in Britain, reduced to hiding on the floor of a car to leave the home she'd lived in longer than most marriages last. There was no farewell appearance, no final statement, no goodbye to the cameras that had followed her for most of her adult life. She simply, quietly, stopped being seen. The fallout extended well beyond the property itself. In the weeks after the October 2025 announcement, 6 companies linked to Ferguson began the process of being formally dissolved. Her charity, Sarah's Trust, announced it would close for the foreseeable future, citing the damage to her public image. Organizations that had once been glad to have her name attached to theirs, including major cancer and heart health charities, quietly removed her as patron, without press releases or public statements, simply erasing the association and moving on. Reports suggested former royal aides had privately advised her to step fully out of public life and consider ordinary, non-royal work, and that the idea of a tell-all memoir, floated at points as a possible source of income, had been abandoned as too risky given how badly it could backfire. It's worth remembering what Ferguson had actually built in the years before this collapse, because the scale of the loss only makes sense against that backdrop. After her divorce, she spent decades trying to construct an identity independent of the royal family, one that didn't rely on a title she technically no longer held. She wrote a long-running series of children's books about a character called Budgie the Little Helicopter. She fronted weight loss campaigns and wellness endorsements. She built relationships with charitable organizations, gave paid speeches, and positioned herself as a philanthropist with a genuine, if sometimes chaotic, public profile. None of it ever fully escaped her royal connection. Arguably, it couldn't have. But by the early 2020s, she had at least managed to construct something that looked like an independent career. The events of late 2025 and early 2026 didn't just cost her a home. They dismantled almost everything she had spent nearly 30 years building around that home. Then, on February 19, 2026, Andrew's 66th birthday, Thames Valley Police arrived at Wood Farm, his temporary Sandringham residence, and arrested him on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The allegation, tied directly to the newly released Epstein documents, was that while serving as the UK's special representative for international trade and investment, he had shared confidential government reports, from trade visits to Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Singapore, with Epstein. It was, by any measure, historic. The first arrest of a senior member of the British royal family in centuries. He was held for roughly 11 hours before being released under investigation, meaning he was neither charged nor cleared. King Charles issued a short public statement saying he had learned of the arrest with the deepest concern, and that the law must take its course. Police later searched his properties as part of the ongoing investigation. Where was Sarah Ferguson while all of this was happening? Not at Sandringham, and not visibly anywhere near the unfolding crisis. Her public trail had already gone cold. What's known from later reporting is fragmented and in places contradictory, which is itself telling for a woman who used to be one of the most trackable public figures in the country. Some reports placed her overseas in the weeks around the eviction. By spring, tabloid reporting put her at an undisclosed alpine ski resort, reportedly paying several $1,000s a night for a chalet, at a time when she had not been invited to stay with either of her daughters. Other reporting in the following months described her as effectively without a fixed address, moving between friends' homes and at points wellness retreats, while speculation about offers of a place to stay, including one from actress Priscilla Presley that Presley's team later denied, circulated in the tabloids without ever being confirmed. As of mid-2026, British outlets were still openly asking the question, where does Sarah Ferguson actually live now? One royal editor's answer, delivered on a royal watching podcast, was blunt. If she wanted to be found, she would be. The most recent reporting from late July 2026 offered at least a partial answer. According to The Sun, Ferguson had been staying at the Swiss chalet of Paddy McNally, a businessman she had dated in the early 1980s, long before she met Prince Andrew. McNally died on July 21, 2026, at 88 after a long illness, and a source close to the pair said he had looked after her at points throughout their decades-long friendship and had made arrangements to ensure she wouldn't be left with nothing. It's a quietly poignant detail that the safety net Sarah Ferguson ultimately leaned on wasn't a royal residence or an institution she'd spent 40 years attached to, but an old boyfriend from before any of it began. Through all of this, the palace's public posture has been almost total silence on Ferguson specifically. Andrew's story has been marked by formal statements, legal notices, and a highly publicized arrest. Ferguson's has been marked by an absence of acknowledgement. No comment on her departure. No comment on her whereabouts. No comment on her financial situation. That silence isn't necessarily sinister. Institutions often say nothing about people who no longer hold any official position, and Ferguson never had royal title or income in her own right to begin with. But it does mean that a woman who spent nearly 2 decades living inside one of Britain's most storied estates left it, in the end, without so much as a sentence of public farewell from the family she'd shared it with. There's also a broader question sitting underneath this story that's worth naming honestly, rather than answering with false certainty. How much of what happened to Sarah Ferguson was really about her own choices? And how much of it was simply the fallout of being tied, for over 3 decades, to a man whose own choices proved catastrophic? It's a genuinely difficult question, and the honest answer is probably both, in ways that are hard to fully separate. She chose to remain at Royal Lodge for years after her marriage ended. She chose to keep defending Andrew publicly through wave after wave of scandal. She maintained her own friendship with Epstein long enough, and warmly enough, that it produced the kind of written record that doesn't leave much room for the gigantic mistake, framing she offered in 2011. At the same time, she was never accused of the underlying conduct that destroyed Andrew's public standing, and much of what happened to her, the lease termination, the exclusion from the palace's public statements, the closing ranks around Andrew's punishment, was decided by other people for reasons that were ultimately about protecting the institution rather than about her individually. What happens next for Sarah Ferguson is genuinely unclear, and anyone claiming to know for certain is speculating rather than reporting. She has lost the home, the 6 companies, the charity, and the informal royal adjacent status that had defined her public identity since the 1980s. She has also, by multiple accounts, made clear she isn't seeking royal charity or a grace and favor solution, and is instead trying to build something entirely her own, however uncertain that path looks right now. Her ex-husband remains under investigation, his future far from settled. Her daughters have kept a careful public distance from the entire saga, continuing their own lives, Beatrice in Oxfordshire with her family, Eugenie largely based in Portugal, without publicly weighing in on their mother's situation. And Sarah Ferguson herself, once one of the most recognizable women in Britain, a woman who couldn't walk down a street without being photographed for most of her adult life, has spent the better part of a year being genuinely difficult to find. For a woman who built and rebuilt her public identity in front of cameras for 40 years, that disappearance might be the